Okay, yeah, we can go ahead and get started now. So hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Vivek. I'm a former MSF alum. I'll be the moderator for the session today. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Seaman. Dr. Seaman is the group leader for the machine intelligence group at Draper, where she applies machine learning and computer vision algorithms to a variety of applications. And Dr. Seaman has led machine learning and data science projects in a variety of fields such as biology, finance, and computer vision for autonomous underwater vehicles. She holds a bachelor's of biological engineering from MIT and a master's in statistics and a PhD in bioinformatics from the University of Michigan.
Thanks for the introduction. And we will have time for questions at the end. So if anybody wants to drop questions in the chat as we go, we will, have time for that in a second. Okay, sure. Okay, gonna get there. Okay. So I'm going to start out with a little bit about what machine learning is, what it's used for, that type of stuff. And then I'll talk a little bit more about using machine learning in biology, which is where I tend to do a lot of my work. I'll talk a little bit about my path and my career to where I am now. And then I'll talk about an example of using machine learning to identify genetic engineering. At the end, I'll talk a little bit about some trends and resources before opening it up for questions. So in terms of machine learning, it's the use of data and algorithms to imitate the way humans learn, gradually improving in accuracy by looking at that data. And it's a subfield of artificial intelligence. I'm sure many of you know this, but artificial intelligence more broadly is the idea of leveraging computers and machines to mimic the problem solving and decision making capabilities of the human mind. And it's a very simple example here on the right is an example where we have measurements of flower size and shape, so the sepal length and width, and we're using that to classify what type of flower it is. So this is obviously kind of a toy example, but you can kind of see here that based on the values and the length and width, you can make a pretty good guess at what type of flower it is, with the different flowers being represented by those different colors. And this is an example of using a support vector machine, which is one specific type of machine learning algorithm to do this. So this is kind of a toy example, but it gets much more complex than this when we get into real problems. And machine learning is used on a wide variety of problems at this point. So a couple of examples here. We've got recommendation systems, think Netflix and how they try to decide what TV shows to recommend or what you might want to watch next. There's a lot of looking at data and other participants and people who like similar shows to try to figure that out. Self-driving cars is another big kind of application of machine learning. So in this case, it's an image where it's using the camera that would be on the front of a car, and it's able to figure out where cars are, where people are, and where the street is. And all of that information would be used to make decisions about how to actually drive. And then the third example that I pulled up here is the idea of voice assistance. So when you're talking to your Alexa or whatever other assistant it may be, there's actually a lot of different types of machine learning involved in that, because there's the machine learning that allows it to recognize the speaking and convert that into text. That's kind of and then there's additional natural language processing or processing of that text to figure out what does that question mean? If you're asking what's the weather, what does that mean? And then it will go out and get that information and figure out how to put that back into text and then back into voice to reply that information to you. And there's lots of data involved in all of those steps and training the algorithms to do each part of that process. So with that, I'll jump into some information on my career and machine learning for biology. So I did high school down in Texas and Oklahoma, moved around a little bit, and did a little bit of programming back then, but not a lot. Was very into kind of math and science more broadly. And from there, I went to undergrad at MIT. And did biological engineering. And that was where I really first got my interest in kind of machine learning and programming and all of this space. My junior year, one of the required classes was a computational biology class. And during that class, we talked about the idea of using data and machine learning and data science more broadly to be able to predict or design new drugs. So the idea is it's very hard and expensive to make a new drug, and there might be ways that computational tools could help improve that and make that better and find drugs where it hasn't been able to be done before. And so that's what really sparked my interest in kind of the computational side of things. And from there, I specialized that a little bit more, and then ended up going to the University of Michigan for grad school in bioinformatics. While I was there, I studied how DNA folds inside cells and how that is messed up during cancer. And this is a picture of some of that work on the right. I won't necessarily get into the details of that, but it used a lot of math, specifically linear algebra, lots of looking at matrices and trying to find patterns in them and what those patterns mean. And once I finished up my PhD, I went to Michigan as a machine learning scientist and then as a group leader. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about machine learning is there are many different ways in which the same math can be used for a lot of different applications, and the same algorithms can be used for a lot of different spaces. And one of the things I figured out since being at Draper is actually the math that I was using to look inside cells in my PhD program is also essentially the same math that we use to understand social networks and the way communities and groups form within that space. And as Vivek mentioned earlier, I've worked on a pretty wide variety of applications while there, but because of my bio background, I do tend to work quite a bit in that space. And I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you about an example kind of in the genetic engineering and biology space. So Felix is a program that I've worked on for about 3.5 years now. And the basic idea here is genetic engineering is getting much more common and much easier to do. This is the idea that you have DNA inside cells, and there are ways that through biology we can change what that DNA says and what it does and manipulate it to do something that wouldn't have done naturally. So on the left here is an example of using genetic engineering to make mice that would be resistant to Lyme disease, which could really help reduce the frequency of that. And then on the right here is kind of examples of home genome editing tools that you can order and use. And that's really cool and exciting from the idea that anybody can go in and do this, but it's also kind of concerning if you're thinking about this from what might happen by accident or kind of a bioterrorism perspective. And so one of the things that Draper, Harvard, and BU, we formed a team and worked on this to figure out ways to rapidly identify genetically engineered organisms in complex samples. And so the basic idea is we wanted to be able to look in a sample of soil or anything and find, is this genetically engineered? And this is actually a really hard problem because if you have a pure sample, so if you have just a mouse or just some corn, then finding manipulation in that isn't too difficult. It's like maybe trying to find a paragraph of text in a 4,000-page book. That'd be a really big book, so it would take you a while, but you could realistically read through that and figure out if there's something in there that's not supposed to be in there. The problem comes when you get into more complex samples. So if we think about, what might have gone down somebody's sink or in soil or a swab, that's going to have a lot of different things in it, and it gets much more complicated very quickly. And so all of a sudden, instead of finding a paragraph in a book, it's like trying to find a paragraph in the Library of Congress, and you can only look at random sampling of individual pages. It's just unlikely that you're going to find it at that point. And so the approach that we took to fix this is a kind of wet lab biology approach to enrich for science of engineering. So we had certain elements that we know are used in the genetic engineering process. And so we can look for those engineering markers and try to find anything else around it. And what happens is this process physically captures these engineered elements or these sentences that we think are of interest and increases their frequencies relative to everything else. And that means that then when we sequence, when we go look at what was in the sample, we get more of that information about that engineering. And there's this entire wet lab process, but there's also a lot of data science and machine learning that was required to convert the sequencing data into useful results. And that is the part of the project I was primarily involved with. So I'm not going to go through all of the details of this figure, but the basic idea is when you get information in a genetics context, you start with short DNA sequences. And there's a lot of information in there, but it's not easy to look at. It's not easy to understand or get meaning from. And so we built a pipeline to kind of help counter that. And the point of the pipeline is to really help tell a story and make it so that an expert can then look at those results and quickly determine, is this engineered or not? And there are 5 main steps in the pipeline that we built. There's an alignment step, which is the process of figuring out, of all of the information we have, which part of that information is relevant to those engineering markers that we were looking for. We do some filtering to make sure we're looking at the most useful information. Assembly is the process of building up these short pieces of DNA into longer segments of DNA. And then it's some annotation to figure out what is in those longer segments and figure out where they're coming from and what it means. And then some visualization and summarization, kind of help pull together some results, make some figures that people can look at, and some tables that kind of tell as much as we can, in one simple, easy to look at place. So where the machine learning comes in, obviously there's lots of code writing that happens to build all of that out. But the machine learning specifically came in kind of the optimization process. So when we're building this pipeline, there are many choices to make in terms of exactly how do we want to do that filtering? What are the best parameters to use when we're doing assembly? There's just lots of choices to be made. And we actually created an algorithm that automatically determines when results are kind of good or when they're less good. And this essentially relied on things like, we want to be able to have big segments, and we want the engineering markers to be all in one piece, and some kind of heuristic-based methods for understanding, okay, what is a high quality result? And because we created that, we were then able to use kind of machine learning and optimization to choose the best possible parameters and make sure we're getting the best results at each time. And the goal was to make it easy to interpret by a genetics expert. And the figure at the bottom is an example of something that we end up getting. So the green box at the top is showing one of these genetic elements that we were looking for. And what we can see in this figure is that on the 2 sides, there is the same piece. So each row in this figure is a different organism, a different type of bacteria, and where that DNA came from. So what that second row is showing is that there's Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is essentially a type of yeast. So there's yeast DNA at the 2 ends, and then there was other DNA in the middle. And that's a pretty clear signature that that's genetically engineered, because normally you would expect it to just all match to yeast if it was the kind of natural version. And yeah, so that's a little bit about that project. I'm happy to talk about it more during the question segment in a little bit, but first I'll talk a little bit about trends and some of the resources that are available if you want to learn more about machine learning, get involved in this space. So first, data is everywhere, and learning how to use it is going to be very helpful for a wide variety of careers. Even if you decide that you don't want to do machine learning, having some understanding of data is just really useful. So I highly recommend taking a basic kind of data science or statistics class if that's an option to you, whether in high school or college. In terms of learning about machine learning, it's really useful to try to get both an understanding of the math and how the algorithms work and what that's doing, but also try it on real data, because real world problems are often messy. We can have this theory about how it's going to work, but often, when you start trying to use it, you'll run into things that you might not have expected, especially with kind of more free-form data. Missing data can be really hard. Oftentimes there can be quite a bit of formatting and things that you have to do before you can kind of throw it into the machine learning algorithm. And so, spending some time trying real data is very useful. The other thing that also they're out there is machine learning is being used in pretty much every field. So combining machine learning and another interest is definitely, a way to make a career. That's definitely what I've done with kind of the machine learning and biology type approach. These are just examples. There are many more. It's being used in agriculture, healthcare, business, physics. I know some people that work at the Large Hadron Collider, applying machine learning to the physics that's happening there. And then I thought I would also highlight some of the active areas of research and things where machine learning is still trying to improve and get better and figure out how to approach it. Is the adaptability or generalizability of models. So often machine learning models will be very good at the very specific thing that they were trained to do. But often if you change much of anything about the scenario, then they won't work very well anymore. And there's a lot of effort to make sure that, if you trained your self-driving car on all clear days, it still needs to work when it's rainy. And so there are a lot of efforts to kind of make sure that it will be able to deal with kind of shifting scenarios. Another area of research is around the fairness and ethics for AI, as AI is being used more and more in all of our lives. It's really important to think about what the effects of that is and try to counter as much as we can any bias and negative effects that might come from using AI. And then the third area that I have here is building data sets from small, or building models from small or unlabeled data sets. We've probably all done some of those robot checking things where you have to click every stop sign. And that's really useful when you're training a data because that gives, or a model, because that gives them lots of data on what a stop sign looks like. But there are plenty of other applications where you just don't have millions of images to be able to train on. And so there's a lot of interest on finding techniques and methods that can work even if you don't have a ton of data. In terms of resources, there are so many resources out there on the web. And so I just pulled a couple of my personal favorites. So I would say overall, Python is the most commonly used language in data science and machine learning. There are lots of other languages that are used. It's not the only option, but I think it's the most frequently used. And Anaconda is a common download of Python that includes Python and a bunch of other packages that are useful, and also an editor. Within Anaconda actually come both Pandas and scikit-learn. So Pandas is a data science and math package that is commonly used for storing, organizing, processing data. And then scikit-learn is a machine learning package. And I would say their website in particular includes a lot of good demonstrations and information on using the various machine learning algorithms. Kaggle is a website that does challenge problems. So they release data sets. You can try to build a machine learning model on it, make predictions and submit those predictions. And they have like live leaderboards of how everyone's doing. And that's nice because they have a bunch of public data sets that are well labeled, ready to use, ready to try out. You can try things out there. And there's also a lot of published code that you can go and look at to see maybe how others were approaching that same problem. And the last thing I on here is YouTube has lots of explainers and tutorials, as does the entire rest of the web. I pulled out a couple of my personal favorites here. 3 Blue, 1 Brown has a series on deep learning and kind of explaining what that is. And then the Coding Train has one on neural nets, which are two kind of specific types of machine learning, but they're pretty common and pretty popular these days. So with that, I will open it up to questions. Drop them in the chat. And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, those YouTube tutorials you highlighted are excellent. I've watched all of those and they're really, really, really good ones.
Yeah, I really like, I think, you know, depending on what I'm wanting to do, if I'm in the process of writing code, then I think I often like more of a text-based tutorial because it's easier for me to go in and see code snippets and try those and run those. But if what I'm trying to do is like more generally understand a method or an approach or an algorithm, then I think that's where the kind of video versions can be really useful because it's just nice to have somebody there kind of explaining overall what it means, what it's doing, and how you might be able to use it.
Yeah, I watched a lot of those when I was in high school and trying to figure out stuff. I posted in chat also one other resource that I really like for finding open source data sets in a variety of fields. GitHub is also, I think, like a really, really useful tool. Do you use it a lot when you're in industry, or is it mostly like an academic thing?
I use GitHub. In industry, I think we often have like internal versions. So we use Git, not necessarily GitHub, because, you know, depending on your company, they may or may not want all of your code being public. But absolutely, Git is something we use all the time. We have internal versions of it where only people at our company can get to and access the code. And it's a great spot. I do have stuff on GitHub, mostly from classes that I've taught, tutorials, grad school, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's definitely a place you can go and find code and lots of examples. I think GitHub is both great and can be a little more hit or miss. There's a ton of high quality stuff on there and a ton of not high quality stuff also. So yeah.
If there aren't questions from the audience, I can also just hop in here. Oh, okay. There's one in the chat.
Yeah, so can I differentiate between what I found most useful in college and learning versus lived experience? Yeah, so I think the main well, I guess there are a couple of things. One, I didn't really use Git until I actually got into industry. I think plenty of people do. I think some of that comes from, I don't have a traditional computer science background. I never, like, that wasn't what my major is. And so I'm relatively self-taught in terms of coding. I took several classes, but I didn't go through the full major. And so I think Git is extremely useful. I highly recommend it. If you're going to be doing a project, it does version control, so it lets you keep track of all of your code. And as you're making updates, you can make branches and keep track of everything and keep it organized. It's useful, I think, whether you're working in a team or by yourself. So I think that is definitely one thing. I think the other thing is, that's where I mentioned, like, try to spend some time with some real data, because I think in at least machine learning classes that I took, often the data sets were like pretty clean and pretty ready to be used. And so, the machine learning homework that we had were often like, here's a data set, we're gonna, run it through the algorithms. I guess it was much more focused on just the algorithms, sometimes coding them up from scratch, or sometimes using, a version that is already out there. And I think that a lot of machine learning in practice, that is part of it, but another big part of it is kind of getting the data ready. So figuring out, how do you load in the data? What do you do if there's data that's missing? How do you organize it and clean it and normalize it and do whatever else you might need to do before you throw it in? And yeah, I mean, I think depending on the class, you may get some introduction to that. Certainly in a data science class, I would expect that to be true. More mixed results, I would say, in a machine learning class. But I think that is a big part of it in practice with what we do. Is a lot of it is about how do we use that? I guess the other thing that I think that I have found in practice is it can be important to make sure that you're using best practices for like whatever data type it is. Like, one of the things that's nice about machine learning is you can put in almost any type of data. If you have a label, it will make a prediction. And so in many ways, you don't necessarily have to understand all of the nuances of the data you're putting in. But I think often you will get better results if you do understand some of the nuances of that data. And I think, like, as an example, that's where I think like my biology background can be really helpful, because it lets me, like, when I'm in there and doing the analysis, I understand what the data is and what it represents. And so that gives me a better ability to kind of gut check the results and say, like, okay, does this make sense? Is this logical? Is what I'm getting out making sense? And if not, then I have a basis to be able to go and go, okay, how can I change this to try to make things better? And so I think it can be really useful to spend some time learning about whatever the application is that you're working on, because I think that can help make the results better.
And one question I think would probably be pretty useful for like high school students as well is, as you've mentioned, like, there's a lot of math behind the theory of machine learning. You mentioned linear algebra. If you want to do any sort of deep neural network stuff, backpropagation requires multivariable calculus. And like, these aren't things that you typically learn in high school. So for like really wrapping your head around like more of the theory behind it, what would you give as advice for high schoolers who are wrestling with these really, really complex and abstract math fields?
Yeah, so I think it's okay. I'm gonna think. So I think there is a lot of really advanced math, and I think even most people, like, I took machine learning classes, I learned a lot of the theory behind it, and yet I can also say day to day when I'm using these algorithms, I'm not necessarily thinking about the details of the math behind them anymore. So I think it is possible to use them and use them well without understanding every detail of that algorithm. In terms of trying to understand it, though, one of the things that I do is I try to look for kind of intuitive explanations for how things work. I think that's where toy examples can be useful, or anything where you can kind of build up an intuition around something, how something works. Because I'm probably better than average at reading math notation and getting meaning out of all of these like complex symbols and write-ups of how this stuff works. But I think that's just really hard. And so to the extent that you can, find tutorials that are using visualizations and kind of going through a more intuitive approach to understanding it, I think that can help you, gain an idea of how it's working, even if there might be some of the details of the math that you haven't fully grasped yet. Sure, yeah. So pivot points in my career. Yeah, I think there definitely have been. I think as is, I'm discovering is true with many people's career, it looks much more linear in hindsight than it felt at the time. When I was in undergrad doing genetics or doing biological engineering, I did not expect that I would eventually end up in like a machine learning field. And so, yeah, I think there were definitely pivots in there. Primarily when I went to grad school, I think that was definitely one time. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. During undergrad, I'd taken this class on computational biology and just really enjoyed that. And I found it really fascinating. So I wanted to learn more about that. And then also actually when I was leaving grad school and trying to decide what to do next, I had to kind of decide like, okay, did I want to stay in academia? Did I want to get kind of a pharma biotech route or go more machine learning and more other avenues? And I actually interviewed for a pretty wide mix of biotech and machine learning type stuff. And I think really I was really interested in Draper. And so that kind of appealed to me. I guess when I started talking to them, I think there were two things that were interesting. One is I really like biology, and it's important to me. I think that I keep some of that in my work because I think it's really important and compelling, and I think that's really interesting. But I do also I really like learning, and I really like learning about new areas. And so I think by getting to work on a variety of different applications, that really keeps me interested in the work because I'm constantly learning something new and learning about a new area. And then the second thing is Draper was an interesting point where they had a bunch of biology, like wet lab, people doing pipettes, growing cells, that sort of stuff. And they had a machine learning group, but they hadn't really done much collaboration between them. And so I actually got to be in this really interesting position where I joined kind of intentionally, in the machine learning group, but with the express purpose of doing collaborations with their biology team and really trying to help figure out, okay, with the biology that they're doing, how can we apply data science and machine learning to that and get even more out of the results and the abilities that they were building? And I think that was a really, interesting opportunity to kind of see the intersection between those two spaces and get to learn about that. So yeah, I think those are, I guess, kind of the main two pivots that I've had at this point. I guess somewhat moving into management also, but actually my current job, I both manage people and I also do technical work on projects. So you still get to do some of both, which is definitely something I enjoy. So, yeah.
Sounds like a really powerful thing. You learn how to analyze one data set and suddenly you're transferable to any possible data that could come your way.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the things that I love about machine learning is data is everywhere. Every field has data. It's just everywhere. And so being able to analyze it, there are so many different directions you can go within machine learning. And I think that makes it a really exciting place to be. So yeah, definitely an in-demand skill also.
For sure. All right, well, thank you very much. This was really insightful, and I hope it was helpful to some of the students here. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. Yeah, bye everyone.